there's some people I'd like to acknowledge. First and foremost, we have someone who's come today, and I'm so glad he's here, and that is Professor Phil Beard, who was the director of the Holocaust Studies Center directly prior to my anointing. Professor Beard worked on the lecture series for quite a while, and it was in wonderful, competent hands when he did that. Glad to see him. We have guests with us, but the first person I would like to acknowledge is someone who supports us a great deal. And without her support, we would carry on, but not with as much verve and interest in what we do, and that is we have the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Dean Leader. Thank you for coming. And if that isn't enough for you, I would like to introduce to you Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, who the students here know. Barbara is the new president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, which is the organization that makes a great deal of what you see here possible. So why don't you welcome Barbara.
I love being the short one in the group. Welcome everybody. On behalf of the Alliance, who helps to fund these amazing lectures, I'm very pleased to be here. I want to start with a special thanks to the crew in information technology, without which we wouldn't have this amazing ability to have live video broadcasts. And we haven't really ever acknowledged them because they're usually busy working. Jay Field is the person who was here earlier getting everything set up. I think Bill Bailey and Mo Lanis are back on the monitors, out of sight, and Katie Music and Desiree Gonzalez. Thank you so much. We also have a number of members of the Alliance who are here. Some haven't been here for a year, some haven't been here for a week. Evie Sackler, Walter and Cheryl Kuttner, Hildy and Toby Katz, Irv Newman, and we know that Howard Harris will be joining us later. Without their undying support for this series, we wouldn't still be standing here 21 years later. Thank you so very much.
I want the students to make sure that they're taking notes. Did we forget anybody? Joel's next. I'd also like to recognize our guests from the North Bay Armenian community who we got to know last year and who have come for this lecture as well, and we're hoping that we might be able to do this every year. Christine Davidian, and then Richard Cloyer, who is the executive director of the Armenian Genocide Resource Center. Each year we understand more and more how connected we are through unfortunate experience. Now I would like to introduce the immediate past president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust at Sonoma State University, someone who has been connected with us from the very beginning and will tell us a bit about the person who sponsors this, in whose name we sponsor this lecture every year. And I'd like you to welcome Joel Newberg.
It's the custom among the Jewish people at this time of year to invite strangers into their house for the Passover Seder. 40 years ago this week, I was invited into a house in Stockton, California, by a gentleman I met in college. Actually, he was by that time already tutoring me through many of the courses to allow me to pass my science courses. And there I met a remarkable family. It was not at all unusual for them to include strangers in the Passover meal. And it was a great experience for me. I happen to be Jewish, but that was no criterion for the people that were invited into the Berg household. And one member of that family, I have to say the apparently most serious member of the family, was a gentleman named Uncle Bob. At least that's the way he was introduced to me, Uncle Bob. He impressed me as serious. He took the repeating of the Passover story very seriously. There were others in the group who, for whom it was more an occasion for a display of a sense of humor, let's put it that way. And I saw him actually every year at Passover for about 3 years. I maybe saw him at a wedding after that, and then I didn't see him, I thought, for probably 10 years. I had already started working with the Alliance. I was the director of the Holocaust Center in San Francisco. There were all kinds of conflicts about what you were supposed to teach when you're teaching about the Holocaust, and among those things you weren't supposed to teach was about anything else that could be compared to the Holocaust. We like to say never again, but we didn't look back at previous instances of genocide. Specifically, the Armenian Genocide was not to be taught in courses about the Holocaust. We weren't going to talk about Cambodia. In any case, a gentleman named Robert Harris, who turned out to be Uncle Bob, started working with me, asked me, in fact, to come and help get the lecture series started. I worked with him for, I guess, about 10 years, during which time he was pretty much the sole fundraiser. He was the person who sent out mailings with some help. He was the person who chaired all of our meetings, and our meetings in those days included a large segment of the Sonoma County community. I think Barbara is sort of moving us back towards that. We say that the reason there's a lecture series here at Sonoma State University is because we had an American serviceman, liberator, who was a professor here. We had 2 Holocaust survivors who were professors here. But the real reason this lecture series is here is because we had a retired school administrator named Robert Harris who organized and pushed and had the diplomatic skills to make all these people work together. That's why we named this lecture after him.
Thank you, Joel. It is now my honor to introduce our speaker to you. I asked Professor Melson before we started, was there anything in particular in the biographical statement that he sent me that he wanted excluded or anything he wanted added? And he said something to me, and we just met each other, so he doesn't even know what I'm like, but he wanted you to know that in a small town in Poland, a baby was born many years ago. But seriously. Robert Melson is professor of political science and former acting director of Jewish Studies, the Jewish Studies program at Purdue University. He is the current president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which he helped to found in 1995. He completed bachelor's degrees in mathematics and humanities at MIT in 1959, and after graduate work in anthropology at Yale University. He received his PhD in political science from MIT in 1967. His major area of teaching and research has been ethnic conflict and genocide. His interest in the topic derives from his family's experience in Europe, as well as from his fieldwork in Nigeria during the years 1964 and 65, a year before the onset of the Nigerian-Biafran conflict. The story of his and his family's survival during the Holocaust is told in False Papers, a book he's written, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in the year 2001. His book, Revolution and Genocide on the Origins of the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust, won an international award awarded by a committee of the Dutch Division of Amnesty International. He has published with Howard Volpe as editors Nigeria, Modernization and the Politics of Communalism, and articles in the American Political Science Review, comparative studies in science and history, as well as the article that you read that was in the book, Is the Holocaust Unique? On September 14, 2000, he testified before the House Subcommittee on International Operations and Human Rights concerning the Armenian Genocide. Professor Melson has been a Foreign Area Fellow of the Ford Foundation for Research in Nigeria, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Illinois, and a Fellow of the Center for Humanities Studies at Purdue University. He's held positions as Research Associate at the Harry S. Truman Institute of the Hebrew University, was a Research Fellow at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, and also at the Center for International Studies at MIT. Currently, he's a member of the board of the American Genocide Archive and the Armenian National Institute. Would you please give a very warm Sonoma County welcome to Professor Robert Melson.
Thank you very much, Professor Goodman. Thank you for inviting me to Sonoma County, this beautiful and very warm area of the country. I would also like to thank the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and the Holocaust Studies Center for inviting me, and of course, Dean Leader, and my friends Neil and Lorna Myers, who started me off on this visit by getting in touch with Professor Goodman. In the contemporary era, the world has experienced 4 tidal waves of national and ethnic conflict and genocide in the wake of collapsing states and empires. These waves were punctuated by the First and Second World Wars and by the post-colonial and post-communist periods. During the First World War and its aftermath, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it committed the first total genocide of the 20th century against its Armenian minority. In the same period, the disintegration of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires set off folkish, nationalist, and fascist movements that repressed minorities and precipitated the Second World War. In the context of that war, the Nazis attempted to exterminate the Jews and Gypsies and committed partial genocide against other people, like the Polish people. Following the Second World War, as former European colonial empires, notably Britain and France, withdrew from their possessions, they left behind fragile regimes that lacked legitimacy. Such third world governments frequently ruled over culturally plural societies and tried to impose the hegemony of one ethnic group over the rest. In reaction, minorities rebelled and sought self-determination. When I did my PhD thesis many years ago, I started out in Nigeria in 1965. By 1966, there was a coup, and by 1967, there was mass destruction of the Igbo minority. So this is an example rather close at hand, at least in my experience and my wife Gail's experience. This led to ethnic wars and genocide in places like Indonesia, Burundi, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Iraq. In the wake of the recent collapse of communist regimes in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, we experienced the fourth wave of nationalist upsurge, ethnic conflicts, and genocide. Meanwhile, as in Rwanda, we will be commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide this April 2004. The third wave of post-colonial genocide has not yet spent its force. Some scholars, journalists, and policymakers who have tried to make sense of this history have relied on the Holocaust as a paradigm or prototype for other genocides, especially after 1948, when the United Nations formulated its famous Convention on Genocide. However, I'm going to argue that with the important exception of Rwanda, where racialist ideology played a decisive role, it is the Armenian Genocide and not the Holocaust that provides us with a more accurate precedent for contemporary international crimes that start out as ethnic cleansing and wind up in mass death. This is important for scholars because we need to make appropriate distinctions among instances of genocide that might allow for better understanding and hopefully in the future for prevention. It is equally important for those in power because a faulty application of a precedent can misconstrue reality. Indeed, by setting up the Holocaust as a standard, especially its telling features, such as the exterminatory racist ideology of the Nazis and the methodology of the death camp, people in power in the West were able to make excuses not to intervene to stop genocide in Yugoslavia until it was very late, and not to intervene in Rwanda at all until it was too late. Had they been told not to apply the model of the Holocaust to Bosnia, and had they been made aware of the Armenian Genocide, they might not have come so easily to their self-serving conclusions, and they might not have been able so easily to obfuscate the issue in order not to intervene. The United Nations defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in part or in whole a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Although it uses the same term for the two events, the UN makes a distinction between the extermination of the group, genocide in whole, or total genocide, and the massacre of part of a group. The Armenian Genocide was not only the first genocide of the 20th century in which the state attempted to destroy a whole group, that is, total genocide. It is also a prototype for genocides that came after, some which were total, like the Holocaust and Rwanda, and some partial. Thus, the Armenian Genocide approximates the Holocaust in that the Young Turks of the Committee of Union and Progress, like the Nazis, sought the total destruction of the Armenian community. At the same time, because of the territorial nature of the Armenians and the nationalist ideology of the Young Turks, which distinguish it from the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide is an archetype for ethnic and national genocides, some which have been called ethnic cleansing in the post-communist states and in the Third World. I'll continue with a brief historical overview of the Armenian Genocide. I'll then sketch out a comparison of that event, first to the Holocaust and then to Yugoslavia, and then I'll conclude. In traditional Ottoman society, Armenians, like other Christians and Jews, were defined as a Zimmi millet, a non-Muslim religious community of the empire. Their actual treatment by the state varied to some extent with the military fortunes of the empire, with the religious passion of its elites, and with the encroachment upon their land of Muslim refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasus, and of Kurdish pastoralists. Although by and large Zimmis were free to practice their religion, they were considered to be distinctly inferior to Muslims in status. In the 19th century, the Armenians challenged the traditional hierarchy of Ottoman society as they became better educated, wealthier, and more urban. In response, despite attempts at reforms, the empire became more oppressive, and Armenians, more than any other Christian minority, bore the brunt of persecution. Throughout the 19th century, the Ottoman sultans were caught in the vice between great power pressures on the one hand and the demand for self-determination among their minorities on the other. By the time Abdul Hamid II came to power in 1876, he had set a course of political and social repression and technological modernization. Nevertheless, he could not halt the military and political disintegration of this regime, and he was replaced in 1908 by a political revolution of young Turks with new and radical ideas of how to address the Ottoman crisis. In the first instance, the Committee of Union and Progress, the political organization formed by the Young Turks, attempted radically to transform the regime following liberal and democratic principles that had been embodied in the earlier Constitution of 1876. They hoped for the support of the great powers for their reforms, but neither the European powers nor the minorities reduced their pressures. On the contrary, they took the opportunity of internal Ottoman disarray and revolutionary transformation to press their demands, and between 1908 and 1912, they succeeded in reducing the size of Ottoman territory by 40% and its population by 20%. Concluding that their liberal experiment had been a failure, the Young Turks turned to pan-Turkism, a xenophobic and chauvinistic brand of nationalism that sought to create a new empire based on Islam and Turkish ethnicity. This new empire, stretching from Anatolia to western China, would exclude minorities or grant them nominal rights unless they became Turks by nationality and Muslims by religion. So you had a multinational empire under the Ottomans, ran into crisis, was taken over by the Young Turks. The Young Turks experimented for a while with democratic liberal ideas. These failed. Then they decided that they too would become nationalists like the Europeans had become. And by becoming nationalists, they would then radically exclude minorities. Among them, of course, the Armenians were the most important. This dramatic shift in ideology and identity from Ottoman pluralism to a radical form of Turkish nationalism had profound implications for the emergence of modern Turkey. At the same time, pan-Turkism had tragic consequences for Ottoman minorities, most of all for the Armenians. From being once viewed as a constituent millet of the Ottoman Empire, they suddenly were stereotyped as an alien nationality. But it's even under the Ottomans, where there had been periodic persecutions of Christians and others for about 500 years, the Armenians had a real role to play in the empire. By the time of the Young Turks, by the time of radical nationalism, they stopped having this role. The situation became especially dangerous because of their territorial concentration in eastern Anatolia on the border with Russia, Turkey's traditional enemy. Thus, the Armenians at one and the same time were accused of being in league with Russia against Turkey and of claiming Anatolia, the heartland of the projected pan-Turkic state. This was a situation even before the First World War. When war broke out, however, the Young Turks, led by Talat and Enver, joined the German side in an anti-Russian alliance that would allow Turkey to expand at Russia's expense. It was in this context of revolutionary and ideological transformation and war that the fateful decision to destroy the Armenians was taken. By February 1915, Armenians serving in the Ottoman army were turned into labor battalions and either worked to death or killed. By April that year, the remaining civilians were deported from eastern Anatolia and Cilicia in an early form of ethnic cleansing towards the deserts near Aleppo. The lines of Armenian deportees were set upon and again by Turkish and Kurdish villagers who were often incited and led by specially designed killing squads. These units had been organized for their murderous purposes at the highest levels of the Young Turk regime. Those Armenians who escaped massacre were very likely to perish of famine on the way. In this manner, between 1915 and the armistice in 1918, some 1 million people out of a population of 2 million were killed. Later, 500,000 more Armenians perished as Turkey sought to free herself of foreign occupation and to expel minorities. Thus, between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1/2 to 3/4 of the Armenian population was destroyed in the Ottoman Empire. And this was then the first major genocide of the 20th century. The Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust are the principal instances of total domestic genocide in the 20th century. In both cases, a deliberate attempt was made by the government of the day to destroy in whole an ethnic religious community of ancient provenance. When one compares the situation and history of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire to Jews in Europe, a pattern leading to genocide becomes apparent. It is a pattern that also reveals some significant differences. And it is those differences that link the Armenian Genocide not only to the Holocaust, but to contemporary instances of that crime. Let me consider the similarities between the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. First, under the pre-revolutionary regimes in the Ottoman Empire and Germany, Armenians and Jews were ethnic-religious minorities of inferior status that had experienced rapid social progress and mobilization in the 19th century. These circumstances helped to create what came to be known as the Armenian Question and the Jewish problem, respectively. That is, both in the Ottoman Empire and in Europe, these two minorities that were in some sense despised minorities created a question or a problem because unexpectedly they started doing rather well in the capitalist sector, in art, in education, in urbanization, and in other ways as well. Armenians raised the question and Jews created a problem because neither the Muslim Ottoman Empire nor Christian Europe was prepared to deal with low-status religious minorities that have become increasingly assertive and successful in the modern world. Second parallel, under the pre-revolutionary regimes, Armenians may have suffered massacres and Jews may have experienced discrimination in Germany as well as pogroms in Russia, but in none of these cases was a policy of total extermination formulated or implemented to resolve questions or to solve so-called problems. Genocide followed in the wake of revolutions in the Ottoman Empire and Germany. 3. Following the reversals of 1908 to 12, the Committee of Union and Progress rejected Pan-Islam and Ottomanism as legitimating ideologies linking state to society and turned to Turkish nationalism and pan-Turkism. The Committee of Union and Progress identified the Turkish ethnic group as the authentic political community on which the Turkish state could and should rely, and by implication it excluded the Armenians from the Turkish nation. Armenians were in danger of being conceived as enemies of Turkey and of the Turkish revolutions once Ottoman Turks came to view themselves not in religious but in ethnic terms. What made the Armenian situation significantly more dangerous than that of other minorities was that community's concentration in eastern Anatolia, an area the Turkish nationalists claimed to be the heartland of the Turkish nation. Moreover, the eastern provinces of Anatolia were on the Russian border, Turkey's traditional enemy, casting the Armenian presence in a sinister light. In a similar fashion, a revolutionary situation in Germany allowed the Nazis to recast German identity and ideology. The German Revolution destroyed the Weimar Republic, a democratic republic, undermined the democratic and socialist conceptions of legitimacy, and enabled the Nazis to come to power. Once they controlled the apparatus of the state, the Nazis set about recasting German political identity in terms of their racial and anti-Semitic ideology. This they did by excluding and expelling those whom they defined as non-Aryans and Jews from the newly valued and invented Aryan community. So in both cases, you had revolutionary groups coming to power and redefining who was in and who was out. The Turks were in. In fact, they were not, before the Young Turks came to power, the people who lived in what is today Turkey, what is today the Ottoman Empire, or what was then the Ottoman Empire, did not consider themselves Turks. It was the Young Turks who introduced that term into the Turkish conception. And similarly, in the German case, before the Nazis, people didn't think of themselves as Aryans or non-Aryans, but with the Nazis there came this new conception, kind of this racialist conception of identity, that some people were good and pure and true, and others were wicked, and the good and pure and true were the Aryans, and the wicked were the Jews. 4. When the First World War broke out, the Committee of Union and Progress, when I say the Committee of Union and Progress, I mean the same thing as the Young Turks, enthusiastically joined the Ottoman Empire to the Germans, to the German Empire against the Russian. This permitted the leaders to claim that the internal Armenian enemy was in league with the external Russian foe, wartime circumstances that were used to justify the deportation and destruction of the Armenian community. Similarly, the Nazis launched the Second World War in order to carve out an empire for Germany, and it was under wartime circumstances that they implemented their policies of partial genocide against Poles, Russians, and others, and their extermination against the Jews. In particular, they viewed the Soviet Union as their principal foreign foe, and they assumed that it was ruled by, quote, a world Jewish conspiracy. Thus, in 1941, at the same time that they invaded the Soviet Union, they launched what came to be known as the Final Solution. In this way, these ideological groups, vanguards, used the opportunities created by revolution and war to destroy ancient communities that had been judged, quote, problematic under the pre-revolutionary regimes and enemies under revolutionary and wartime circumstances. These elements, the pre-revolutionary status of the victims and revolutionary wartime circumstances, may be said to account for some of the essential similarities between the two genocides. There were, however, significant differences as well. The perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide were motivated by a variant of nationalist ideology. The victims were a territorial ethnic group that had sought autonomy and the methods of destruction included massacre, forced deportations, and starvation. In contrast, the perpetrators of the Holocaust were motivated by racism and anti-Semitism, ideologies of global scope. The victims were not a territorial group, and so, for the most part, they had sought integration and assimilation instead of autonomy, and the death camp was the characteristic method of destruction. At the same time that these differences, that is to say, the nationalist ideology of the perpetrators, the territoriality of the victims, and the methodology of destruction, especially expulsion and starvation, differentiate the Armenian Genocide from the Holocaust. They link it to contemporary destructions in the Third World and in post-communist states. In that sense, as I've noted, the Armenian Genocide predates and partly encompasses both kinds of genocide and is thereby a prototype for genocide in our time. Because the Armenian Genocide parallels in some sense the Holocaust, but it also differs from it. And it's those very differences, that make it a precedent for contemporary destructions. In Bosnia, in Nigeria, that was something familiar to me, and so on. Let me then spend a few minutes talking about these differences and how they apply to one case, Yugoslavia, the contemporary case of, as you all know, in the 1990s, Yugoslavia collapsed in civil war, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. A definite history of the recent conflict in former Yugoslavia does not yet exist, but it is possible to render a provisional sketch. The Yugoslav disaster stemmed from the failure of the communist regime to establish a legitimate government, a viable economy, and a compelling political culture. After Tito's death in 1980, ethnically based nationalist movements started to mobilize and to demand greater autonomy. The process of dissolution and disintegration was drastically accelerated with the rise of Slobodan Milosevic, who articulated an integral form of Serbian nationalism and irredentism that called for the creation of a Yugoslavia dominated by Serbia, such as had existed after the First World War. This frightened other nationalities and encouraged intransigent elements. Milosevic's integral Serbian nationalism in the context of Yugoslav and communist institutional decay and insecurity helped to sharpen ethnic enmities, to strengthen centrifugal forces throughout the Federation, and to accelerate the process of disintegration. Thus, on September 27, 1989, the Parliament of Slovenia, one of the components of Yugoslavia, adopted amendments to its constitution giving the Republic the right to secede from Yugoslavia. Thousands of Serbs demonstrated in Novi Sad, fearing for their status in an independent Slovenia. On July 3, 1990, the Parliament of Slovenia declared that the laws of the Republic took precedence over those of Yugoslavia. On December 22, 1990, Slovenia reported that 95% of the voters supported a plebiscite on independence, and on June 25, 1991, Slovenia declared its independence from Yugoslavia. Thus began the disintegration of that state. A similar march of events occurred in Croatia, which also declared its independence on June 25, 1991. The big difference between Slovenia and Croatia, however, was the presence of a large Serbian minority in the latter. Moreover, no sooner was independence declared in Croatia than the regime launched an anti-Serb campaign that would have alarmed the Serbs, even if nationalist elements among them had not been earlier mobilized by Slobodan Milosevic. Now that their kin were being threatened in Croatia, Milosevic and other Serbian nationalists could call forth the terrible history of the Ustasha genocide of the Second World War to mobilize the Serbs against Croatian independence and in support of Serbian irredenta. During the Second World War, the Nazis came to the support of the Croatian state. The Croats, nationalists, the Ustasha, joined with the Nazis and began to try to exterminate Jews, Gypsies, and Serbs. And that led to a sense of despair and a fury in the Serbian areas of Yugoslavia. Later, when Yugoslavia became independent, Nazis had been defeated, became unified by a nationalist communist by the name of Tito. There was an attempt to keep the country together by federalizing it and by apportioning different positions to different groups, the Croats, the Serbs, the Montenegrins, the Kosovars, and so on. And with Tito's death, that system began to collapse. But in addition to that, people were still alive who remembered what had happened during the Second World War, especially in Serbia. And now they began to see, or began to fear, that what had happened, what was happening to them in the 1990s, was something similar to what had happened to them during the Second World War. And that allowed Milosevic to play on their fears of the Croat Ustasha, and then, interestingly enough, on the Serbian fears of the Muslim minority, who the Serbs began to call Turks. Okay? This is an irony of history here. This Muslim minority, they were Serbo-Croatians, they spoke Serbo-Croatian, they happened to be Muslim, they had converted to Islam during the Ottoman period, but they were by no means Turks. Now, given the new context of insecurity and anger and fear, this Muslim minority in Bosnia began to be viewed as Turks. After June 25, 1991, when Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence, thereby creating Serbian minorities, especially in Croatia and Serbia, radicals using the cover of the Yugoslav army launched an attack whose main intent was to incorporate Serbian-populated Croatian territory, and to this end, Serbian forces not only initiated hostilities, but set out on a path of terrorism and massacre in order to drive Croats out of areas that they desired to incorporate into Greater Serbia. Even as I'm reading this, I get the sense of the kind of sterility of this. I mean, how do you drive people out? You terrorize them. How do you terrorize them? You terrorize them by killing those who hang around. And in the Yugoslav case, especially, mass rape was one of the ways that people were driven out of their homes. Especially mass rape in Bosnian areas, especially for Muslim women. This was an extraordinarily ferocious attack. The policy of terrorism and ethnic cleansing was set in motion with even greater ferocity against Bosnia when it declared its independence on March 3, 1992. Indeed, in time, both Serb and Croat forces descended on Bosnia with clear intention of carving up and destroying a state that had initially tried to stand aside from ethnic nationalism and had opted for pluralist society. Bosnia was the state in the federalist Yugoslavia that had really believed in Yugoslavia. There had been intermarriage between Muslims and Serbs, both, and Croatians, and more people than in any part of Yugoslavia considered themselves Yugoslavs in Bosnia than either in Serbia or in Croatia. Indeed, both Serb and Croat forces ascended on Bosnia with a clear intention of carving up and destroying a state that initially had tried to stand aside from ethnic nationalism and had opted for pluralist society. But both Serb and Croat nationalists were intent on either carving up and destroying Bosnia or making of it a rump state that would collapse. To this end, especially the Serbs, led by Karadzic in Bosnia, practiced massacre, ethnic cleansing, and cultural destruction against those they called the Turks. Taken together, such policies of destruction on a wide scale are called genocide. Two major similarities between the Armenian genocide and the partial genocide that occurred in Bosnia should be apparent. Like the Young Turks, the Serbian and to some extent the Croat nationalists also dreamt of an enlarged, homogeneous state that would include their peoples and exclude other ethnic and national groups. Like the Armenians, the Bosnian Muslims, an ethno-religious community living on lands claimed by Serbs and Croats, were massacred and driven out by Serb and Croat nationalist movements that sought to incorporate their lands and, quote unquote, cleanse the area of the Muslim presence and Bosnian culture. The status of Bosnia as an independent state was recognized by the international community, making a significant difference between Bosnia and Armenia. Belatedly, after the massacres of 7,000 Bosnian men and boys in July 1995 in Srebrenica, the world community did intervene to stop the slaughter. Srebrenica was is a town in Bosnia that these Serbs claimed. It had been under UN protection. Dutch forces were in that town, and refugees from all over the area fled to that town thinking that that town would be a safe area for them. The Serbian forces surrounded the town and ordered the UN forces to leave. The UN forces complied. When the UN forces complied, the Serbs brought in trucks, loaded these trucks with Bosnian Muslim men and boys, drove the trucks to outside of town, and massacred them. 7,000 to 10,000 people were killed in that operation. That, of course, led to panic and to mass flight of Bosnians from Srebrenica. But of course, Bosnia was by then an independent state, and it was Srebrenica, it was the massacres of Srebrenica that finally led to the American and the NATO intervention to stop the slaughter. And with that intervention, that led to negotiations which prevented further genocide. In contrast, of course, Armenians were largely abandoned to their fate. Nobody stopped their slaughter because, in part, the genocide occurred in the midst of World War, and that kind of intervention could not occur. That partial and not total genocide occurred in Bosnia, unlike Armenia, should be very cold comfort to the world community. 80 years after the Armenian Genocide and 50 years after the Holocaust, genocide occurred in Europe while NATO, the United States, and the United Nations were unable and unwilling to halt the slaughter until over 200,000 were dead and millions had become refugees. The situation was even worse in Rwanda, which was completely abandoned to its fate, and if not for the victory of the army of the Rwanda Patriotic Front, an army composed and led principally by Tutsi refugees, by the very people who were victims, no Tutsi would be alive in Rwanda today. But that is another story. Let me conclude. I've tried to show in this talk that the Armenian Genocide was a precursor and a prototype both for the Holocaust and for contemporary nationalist ideologies. In neither case was it an exact template for these destructions, nor were these genocides duplicates of the Armenian Genocide. Nevertheless, the Armenian pattern of destruction set a terrible precedent for our era and for the future. Thanks. Sure.
Okay, we'll have some questions. Why did the Armenians and the Jews sort of give in to this? Why didn't they fight back?
question is, why did the Armenians and the Jews give in to this and not fight back? First of all, the Armenians, where they could, did fight back. I mean, there were areas of Armenian resistance, brave Armenian resistance, for example, in the city of Van, where where Armenians who were armed and organized and saw what was happening in the other parts of Armenia did fight back. There are other parts as well where Armenians who were organized and had weapons fought back. Where they were not organized, where they did not have weapons, they were not able to fight back. Similarly, in the case of Jews, there's the famous Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. How did the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion occur in April 1943? It occurred because, in time, most of the families of those who stood up and fought had been killed. There were young people who were left in the Warsaw Ghetto. Some of them were Zionists, some of them were communists, some were socialists. They had some help from the Armia Krajowa, Armia Ludowa, the Polish forces, and they were able to get their hands on some weapons. And they fought in this famous Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. But to make a long story short, the fact of the matter is that an unarmed, disorganized civilian population never resists when it is set upon by an organized, armed force that is intent on destroying it. I don't know, how many people in this room? There must be 200 people in this room. Let's say all of a sudden from this door 10 guys walk in with machine guns and they set themselves up. Do you imagine that this brave group here would jump up and attack these guys with machine guns? Or this brave group or that brave group? I don't think so. I think most people would simply sit there thinking to themselves, I'm alone. I'm not part of any organization. I don't have weapons. Let's see what transpires. Maybe I can get through this thing alive. And that's basically what most people thought of when they were confronted with the situation. I don't mean to go on and on. I happen to be interested in this particular topic right this very moment. But from what I can see, when I'm trying to do some comparative work on how people resist genocide, the general rule of thumb is people who are not organized to resist genocide don't resist genocide. Anybody else? Myrna, should I just go ahead and point to people? You want?
Sure. Would you do an
Sure. Sure.
A question about Biafra, Nigeria.
Yes.
You mentioned that Bosnia was by that time an independent state. What makes a state an independent state? Biafra declared itself an independent state, and yet basically the world said, no, this is a civil war. Nigeria has the right to hold that as part of its state.
Right. The question was comparing Bosnia to Biafra. Biafra was set upon and destroyed. Bosnia was almost set upon and destroyed, but Bosnia was considered to be an independent state. It was an independent state in terms of international law. Bosnia was recognized as an independent state internationally by the United Nations, by the United States, and by international law. NATO, the United States, the United Nations were supposed to do something about the destruction of Bosnia. They did nothing until 1995 in Srebrenica. It so happened that Biafra was recognized by two states, by the Ivory Coast and by France, and that was it. So it didn't have the international standing that Bosnia had. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, no, go ahead.
Along the same lines, I actually have a two-part question. maybe contrast that to Nigeria, which you know, within the state had a lot of diverse ethnic breakups to that population, but the state itself still managed to stay together. You know, through the use of federalism, maybe contrast those two things.
Boy, you've got smart people in this university. Good question. And as the usual formula goes, it would take me too long to explain. But let me try it. It's a very good question. The difference between, as I see it, between Nigeria, which was in the article, which I think you read, and Yugoslavia, was in Nigeria, there was an attempt to break up Nigeria. Biafra was such an attempt. It led to a civil war. There was mass death. The federal government at that time blockaded Nigeria, led to 2 million people dying. The big difference was that in the case of Nigeria, the federal government succeeded. It destroyed the secessionist movement of Biafra. In the case of Yugoslavia, it failed. Yugoslavia did not, the Yugoslav Federation did not hold together, and in part because at the very core of the Yugoslav Federation was Slobodan Milosevic and the Serbs who wanted it to be destroyed. So historically, the two states are quite different. I mean, you have in one case a federation that succeeded in staying together. Frankly, I'm not sure it should have stayed together, because if you look at the history of Nigeria since then, it's been a tragic history. It has not led to unity and brotherhood and development and so on. But that's the basic difference. Yes?
We're talking, in essence, about preconditions and comparing the two genocides,
Yes.
the Armenian and Holocaust. And you talk about rapid social change and progress and revolutions as similar and nationalism. I wonder if you could sort of summarize what your fourth point was about the similarities that they wasn't quite sure what else.
Yeah, when years ago, that was after I came back from Biafra, actually. My wife and I came back from, and I started that experience. I was just a young graduate student doing my PhD work on the labor movement, and however, I had this history of having also been born, as Myrna said, in a small town in Poland. A year beforehand, and I had survived the Holocaust with my family, and we'd come to America when I was 10 in 1947, and now I was a graduate student, and I thought, gee, Africa for sure was not going to do what the Europeans did, and Europeans were just a miserable bunch of people, and you know, you could expect genocide in Europe, but Africa was new and progressive and post-colonial. It was great. And we went to Nigeria, and of course, a year later, Biafra broke out. In fact, you could see it breaking up within months. And then all of a sudden, you have mass death in Biafra. And it occurred to me, my God, this is not that different. I mean, of course, there are no death camps, and there's no Hitler, and there's no Nazi ideology, but the mass death is occurring for ethnic reasons, not for racial reasons. Really drove it home to me. And so I started trying to, I'm a political scientist, I do comparative politics. I thought to myself, well, I can't do very much about it, but where I sit, I can do something, which is to try to think things through. And I tried to, from what I knew about the Holocaust, I tried to make some comparisons to Biafra, and that didn't work. And then I remembered about the Armenian Genocide, and I started thinking about the Armenian Genocide as a comparison, and that worked much better. And what were some of the parallels? Well, the parallels were, again, these two kind of ethnic-religious groups. I call them ethno-religious groups. I mean, Jews are both, they're a separate religion, but there are ethnic differences. And the Armenians, too. were a kind of ethno-religious group. And what was happening to them in the 19th century? Well, they were doing better. The 19th century was a period of development, of urbanization, of literacy, of wealth in some cases, both for Jews and Armenians. And that created an issue for European countries and for the Ottoman state, for people that were not ready to see Jews in commanding positions, or for Armenians in commanding positions. That created a terrible problem. That was known as the Armenian Question, or the Jewish problem. That was one parallel. The other parallel was the following: that before the disintegration, the fall of the Ottoman state, and the fall of Germany, there were tensions. In fact, it was much worse for the Armenians than for Jews, because in 1894-96, there were serious massacres that occurred against the Armenians, something that the Jews did not experience in Western Europe. They experienced some massacres in Russia, but not in Western Europe. And in fact, in Western Europe, most Jews were rather optimistic about the future. They couldn't foresee that a First World War would occur, that Germany would collapse, that a Nazi regime would come to power and try to destroy the Jews around the world. Who could foresee that in the middle of the 19th century? But in any case, here's one parallel, the parallel of two groups doing rather well, but being under suspicion in the 19th century. And then comes the other parallel, and the parallel is the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in 1908, beginning with the Young Turks, and the disintegration of Germany following the First World War. Disintegration is not the right word here. It's really the revolutionary coming to power of the Nazis. In both cases, these were revolutionary. The Young Turks thought of themselves as revolutionaries, so did the Nazis. And these revolutionary groups, what do we mean by revolutions? By revolutions, we mean a total change of the political system. What was once the United States of America will not be the United States of America anymore. It'll be the racial state of the Aryans of America. I think there are some people in America today who would love to see that happen. Well, this is exactly what happened in Germany. And in the Ottoman Empire, something similar happened. And given that situation, the Armenians and Jews didn't do very well. And the third parallel was war. It was under the conditions of the First World War that the Armenian Genocide occurred, and under the conditions of the Second World War that the Holocaust occurred. And you can just think about it just for a few minutes. You can see why war allows for these kind of things to occur. The governments are organized for administrative purposes. Civil liberties are abolished. Other alternatives to dealing with minorities become impossible to put into effect. For example, expelling minorities is not possible during wartime. So one solution, the final solution that begins to appear on the horizon for revolutionary groups at war is, you know what, why don't we kill them? And that was the solution that occurred both in the Ottoman Empire and in Germany. Yes?
Your expose of the development of genocide, starting with the Armenian one, is very compelling. And as you describe it, we can see that by the time we get around to Yugoslavia, there is some attempt at international intervention. What is holding the thing? What is holding the international going in there and straightening it out at this point? I mean, we have the United Nations, we have instant communication, and still these genocides happen. Where are they going wrong? What is holding us up?
It's a great question, and Myrna, you're going to get Samantha Powers to come in to talk to you next year. There's a very good book that just came out called A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power. which addresses itself directly to your question. You know, you have young smart people here, and you have somewhat more mature smart people in this crowd. But it's an excellent question. And essentially what Samantha Power said, and I'll just repeat what she said, it is no accident that there's no intervention. That is the policy. That is the policy. The Never Again slogan is BS. It means nothing. As I think she puts it, never again means the Jews will not be killed in Nazi Germany in 1943 again. You know, that's what never again has come to mean. It's the policy of every. She concentrates on the United States, and she shows how, beginning with the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, there was never an intervention until very late in the Bosnian case in the Kosovo. And the answer is because most policymakers make decisions not on human rights grounds. They make decisions on grounds of economic interest and strategic interest. And when push comes to shove and they sit around in a cabinet meeting and they ask themselves, what is the economic interest? What are the strategic interests for intervention? And the answer is none. They do everything possible not to act on that. So it's not an accident. It is the policy of most states not to do anything about it. The best example of that, even better than Bosnia or Armenia or any place or the Holocaust, is Rwanda, where it was perfectly clear what was happening day in and day out. And there was just, everything was, we did everything possible, the French did everything, everybody did everything possible not to do anything. Yes?
Armenian genocide wasn't recognized first as a genocide, and the Turkish government was never made accountable. That acting alone, doesn't it make a statement? And it still doesn't happen today.
Yeah.
It hadn't been recognized and made accountable, perhaps.
Right. Now, this is a very, very important point that you make. Christine, we just met. The important point is this, that the Holocaust occurred, but except for really bizarre movements, neo-Nazis, Nazis, white races, etc., most people in the world recognize that such a thing as a Holocaust occurred. Most importantly, Germany has recognized that a Holocaust occurred. And believe me, some of the best research now done on the Holocaust by historians are German historians. These are the people who really know this stuff. I mean, not only do they know the language, they have access to documents, they have access to archives better than any American historian or any European historian could do. So it's non-Jewish German historians are really doing most of the work. And so, although Jews have worried about the denial of the Holocaust, that's been much overblown. And that's really not a major issue. But a major issue for the Armenian, for Armenians and for all of us is the continuing denial of the Armenian genocide. There's no question about that. And that's something I didn't realize until much later when I started this research. And it dawned on me finally that what that means. What it means is, of course, here, let me give you some historical background. Turkey was defeated in 1918. But in 1919, the Turks rallied under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. And they succeeded in driving the British and the French, the Greeks, out of Turkey and establishing the Turkish Republic in 1923. After that, they essentially denied that an Armenian genocide had occurred. You can ask, well, why would they do that? They would do that because the founders of the Turkish state were the Young Turks, the people I called Enver and Pasha. These were Minister of Interior, Minister of War, Minister of Interior. This whole group of young Turks were, in many ways, the founders of the Turkish state. It was a young state that had now succeeded in 1923 in establishing itself. It could not then turn around and say that the fathers of this state had committed genocide against the minority. I mean, nationalist movements do not like to teach the dark part of their history. I mean, think of American history. How many of us really love to dwell on slavery, right? Or the destruction of Native Americans. We don't really, but we've done that. We really haven't done too badly since the Civil Rights Revolution. But I see some people more mature, and you will remember. I remember coming to this country in 1947 and going into the fifth grade, and we had a unit on American history and the Civil War. And it was taught by a very nice Jewish lady, Miss Berman, very pretty. I loved her deeply. And Miss Berman convinced us all that the darkies had it great. I mean, she was just reading from the textbook. People sang and danced, and it was just like living in a huge kind of summer camp all the time. And, you know, it took years to begin to understand, wait a minute, 11 million people perished on their way from Africa to the New World during the 300 years of New World slavery. It's a lot of people. And they were very badly treated. How many of us really have spent time thinking about it? But now we have, and there has been progress in that way. But Turkey's not going to look at the Armenian genocide, I don't think, for a while. Yes?
By looking at the Armenian massacre or genocide as a precedent to the Holocaust, how would you explain its relative obscurity in common thought, common knowledge?
That's another great question. I mean, the problem is you're asking me kind of a sociology of knowledge question here. I'm giving you my impression. My impression is that when the Armenians came, those Armenians who escaped came to America, many of them lived in Fresno, California, the Armenian community. Some in Watertown, Massachusetts, where I hang out. People were intent on putting their lives together, on getting their kids through schools, on just making it, surviving. And, of course, they remembered within the Armenian community. They remembered there would be books written, there would be memorials read, and so on, within the Armenian community. It didn't really come out of the Armenian community until, I think, ironically, when this country and other countries began to pay more attention to the Holocaust. I think these things are tied in. I think we're all tied in together. And I think to some extent there was less attention paid to the Holocaust before the civil rights movement occurred in this country. I think these things go together. People begin to see things that they did not see before. And I think there was if the civil rights movement made the Holocaust more visible, the Holocaust made the civil rights movement more visible, I think both of those events also made the Armenian genocide more visible. And the other thing to point out, too, is, it takes a few generations to create an intellectual class. People like me. People who actually go to college and are not intent on just making a living to help their families, because that's what they need to do. They don't have the leisure, they don't have the time, they don't have the money to continue on for a doctorate. It takes years to create an intellectual class, and I think it took 2 or 3 generations for an intellectual class to appear, to begin to start documenting what happened. So it's a very good question. if you want to go on and research, you should do this as your doctoral thesis. But we can speculate about it. Yes?
Doctor, comment, and two questions. First comment is, if you remember 1947, you're aging very well. The first part of my two questions is, was there any evidence of real collaboration with the Armenians and the Russians at the time of World War I? And the second question is, would you address maybe geopolitics today, how it's affecting the fact that Turkey maybe is not admitting their culpability in 1915 due to the fact that we geopolitically need their bases and perhaps a foothold in the Islamic world?
I think that's a very excellent point to make. First of all, I mean, there was a question of resistance earlier about would the Armenians resist and so on. There were Armenian nationalist parties, there were Armenian bands, there were Armenian guerrillas. There are generals in the Russian forces of Armenian background. So, and indeed, in some cases, there was slaughter of Turks by Armenian and Russian forces. But atrocities occur in war, and this is totally different from a decision to deport the Armenian community and to massacre it and to starve it to death. That's called genocide. In wars, there are atrocities occur. I mean, American forces have been involved in atrocities, and other forces have been atrocities. It happens. So were there Armenians who were involved in collaborating with the Russians? The answer is yes, but that has very little consequence for our understanding of genocide. The other point, I think, is a very important point. Myrna mentioned that, I don't mean to call attention to myself here, but it is true that 4 years ago, I and some other people were brought up before Congress to testify on the Armenian genocide. And the question before Congress at that time was, should the President of the United States, in his yearly mention of the Armenian genocide, should he use the word genocide, or should he continue using the word massacre or tragedy? That was one part of the problem before the Congress. And the other question before the Congress was, and this was a recommendation to the State Department should instruct its officers, especially those officers dealing with the Middle East, in the Armenian genocide. They should know something about it. And we testified, two of us testified, two people testified on the other side. And then the State Department person came in and essentially said, you know, if this passes the Congress, we will seriously embarrass one of our most valued allies. And besides that, we have Boeing has huge contracts with Turkey. Guess what happened? What happened is nothing happened. That is, to this day, the State Department does not use the term genocide when addressing itself to the Armenian genocide. And the President of the United States, let's see what President Bush will do around April 24th, which is the day when the Armenians commemorate the Armenian genocide. But I'm willing to bet he's not going to use the word genocide because the Turks are opposed to it. And I don't mean to make it purely kind of economic and strategic, but the point of the matter is, if anything, Turkey has become more important for American policy than it was even during the Cold War. Because with the rise of Muslim fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, and Iran as an example of a theocracy, kind of theocratic Muslim state that is an example to other Muslims, well, what is the counterweight? The counterweight is Turkey. Turkey is a democracy. It's a fragile democracy. It's an imperfect democracy, but it's sort of a democracy. It's trying to get into the European Union. Turkey is an extraordinarily important ally of the United States. So for strategic reasons and economic reasons, we will not use the word genocide when addressing the Armenian genocide, given Turkish pressures. Yes.
Last year we had a speaker who talked about the fact that the Armenian genocide seems to continue on in the form of this lack of recognition of what went on. And one of the things he brought up was the amount of property, Armenian property, that would have to be accounted for in some way if the Turks did in fact admit what they had done. And that seems to be another factor which keeps them from moving towards some kind of final resolution of what went on.
I'm sure the most important part of the property are Armenian lands that were taken over by the Turks after the First World War. But maybe Richard Kloyan, who's here can tell us. There was a recent case of New York Life paying, what is it, $25 million?
Yes, it was a settlement that was reached with New York Life. Not all members of the community were particularly happy with the final amount, because if you estimate the number of Armenians who were actually insured and what monies they actually, how that money would have been compounded since 1915, it's a very small amount. Nevertheless, there was a settlement that New York Life agreed to pay a certain amount for Armenians who were insured at the time of the genocide. They found that there were 7,000 insured with New York Life at the time of the genocide. And although there was a class action lawsuit brought on behalf of a number of families. So they just recently settled that. This didn't directly have anything to do with Turkey necessarily, but it was a precedent nevertheless.
Are those efforts continuing?
Well, that's a good question. I think there are a number of people who aren't happy with the final settlement, whether they'll be able to hold sway in the remediation of the policy. I don't really know. There are a lot of other things in the wind, shall we say. We'll see what happens.
Maybe two more questions? Yes.
I find it very interesting that you talk about what happened to the Igbo people. And I'm wondering if there are precedents as well as we start looking at the people in Eritrea and their relationship with Ethiopia, what's going on now in the Sudan and the Congo, if what you're seeing are similar patterns of these partial genocides. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, I think you already have. I think that there are partial genocides ongoing. I think Sudan is a good example of that. By partial, which meant is there hasn't been a decision to destroy the Sudanese, all the Christians and animists in the southern Sudan, but over the 20 years of war in that part of the world. Again, I think these are these astonishing figures that we don't know what to make of, but I think something like 2.5 million people have been killed, and the policy is of destroying people until they succumb, and this has happened in. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, we use the term civil war, and it masks the genocides.
Exactly. That's another very good point. Yeah. Yes. Last question, Lynn?
I'm wondering if there's any correlation between the Kurds have continued to be sort of a burr under the saddle of the Turkish nation besides its other three countries. Could it be that they didn't actually eliminate them because of all the pushing and shoving by the Armenians to, in fact, get them to acknowledge the fact that there was a genocide?
Yeah.
If that's clear.
It is clear, and if I may rephrase your question, in Turkey today, about a third of the population is Kurdish, especially in the eastern areas. And there's been a kind of a low-level guerrilla war by the Kurds against the Turkish state. In fact, if you look in that whole part of the world, there are about 20 million Kurds who are stateless. I mean, they're parts of Iraq, they're parts of Syria, they're parts of Turkey, parts of Iran, and there have been nationalist movements trying to agitate for separate for autonomy. And your point is, could it be that the Turkish state has not eliminated the Kurdish problem because of the Armenian agitation that has raised the stakes for them? Possibly, but let me maybe use this as a kind of teaching device for a point that I was trying to make in this lecture. I think it's very, very significant, very important how the state, how a revolutionary movement defines its victims. When the Ottomans defined the Armenians not as a religious community, but as a national community, that was the first step towards the destruction of the Armenians. Because up to then, they had been seen as a religious community, and within Islam, they were accepted as a minority. Okay? They were accepted as long as they didn't claim to equality with Muslims. But as long as Armenians were willing to play a subservient role, they would not be harmed within that situation. When the Nazis redefined the Jews as a racialist component, I mean, Jews didn't think of themselves as a race. I mean, we're a religious, ethnic group of some kind of a mixed-up group. But we don't consider ourselves as a separate race. But the Nazis defined us that way. Once they defined us that way, we were in a lot of trouble, especially when they argued that we were the cause of everybody's problems and so on. The difference with Turkey and the Kurds was that the Turkish state did not define the Kurds that way. It never did. It saw the Kurds, to this day, the Kurds have been seen as, quote, the mountain Turks. They were accepted. Kurdish nationalism is Kurdish nationalism. By the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Kurds did not accept this notion of themselves as Kurdish, as mountain Turks. They have a certain national identity. And they've challenged the Turkish state to give them more autonomy, more cultural autonomy, to teach their language, to teach their kids, and so on. So that's a very big difference. The Turks never defined the Kurds out of the moral community of Turkey, the way they defined the Armenians out of the moral community of Turkey.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We will have our visitors